As we enter the second year of our 2 week lockdown, I think it's finally time we did a comprehensive look at how a year of lockdowns has affected people. Governments worldwide have been lightning quick to tell us the benefit of lockdowns in flattening the curve or protecting hospitals and stopping the spread. Despite mountains of evidence to the contrary, let's imagine lockdowns have had a significant effect on the virus and have saved lives. If that is the benefit, we are then obliged to look at what the costs of lockdown is for the people living in them. What has it done to their livelihoods, their mental health, their physical health, the lives lost due to lockdown, and what will this year mean for our future? But before we do that, we have to ask, how did we get here? These restrictions for this length of time would have been unimaginable just 2 years ago. So what convinced people to hand over their freedoms and civil liberties without question? Well, the answer is something that's older than humanity itself. And it isn't a virus, although it does spread like one. It's fear. We were made to think the next Black Plague was coming. We had videos like these out of China showing bodies lying in the streets, healthy people collapsing mid-stride as if hit by a sniper, and hospitals that resembled something out of a Hollywood disaster film. As if this wasn't bad enough, we then had Neil Ferguson and his ridiculous modelling for projected outcomes of COVID in the United States and Great Britain. So-called experts from around the globe then took to making their own hysterical predictions for their home countries, leading to an orgy of frenzied panic and fear. People then looked to their governments for protection at the cost of their freedom. The governments, of course, happily obliged, and we've been in lockdown ever since. And how accurate were those projections as of April 2021? United States projection 2.2 million, reality 550,000. UK projection 500,000, reality 120,000. Canada 350,000, reality 23,000. Ireland 120,000, reality 4.8 thousand. The imperial modelling was also applied to no lockdown Sweden, and they predicted 100,000 deaths by June and as high as 183,000 deaths total. The reality 13.5 thousand. It's also worth remembering that in all of these countries, the average age of COVID death is above the age of life expectancy, and over 90% had multiple comorbidities. But the narrative that the next Black Plague had arrived spread through the minds of people faster than the virus spread through their lungs, so we collectively locked down. And how have these lockdowns actually affected people? Well, first, we're going to look at the most immediate impact of lockdowns was that tens of millions of people were made unemployed because their jobs were deemed non-essential. In the United States, unemployment was at 3.5% in February and rose to a staggering 14.8% in April. And much of this in states which people forced into unemployment received little to no aid from the government. Despite the relaxing of restrictions as of January 21, the rates are still nearly double their pre-pandemic levels. Canada had an unemployment rate of 9.4%, almost double pre-pandemic levels. In the UK and most of Europe, unemployment figures can be misleading. The current UK unemployment rate is only 5%, which accounts for 1.7 million people. However, that doesn't tell the full story. They have government aid checks called the furlough payment, being sent out to people who have been forced into unemployment by government restrictions. There are currently 4.7 million people on this. This means that almost 19% of the UK's workforce is not working and stuck at home. This is the reality in most European countries. For example, Ireland has a similar result with only 5.8% unemployment. But if you include the number of people at home, not working, getting checks from the government, 25% of Ireland's workforce is not working. The global estimate for COVID-related unemployment is 147 million. This of course leads to an unprecedented number of business closures. According to Yelp in the United States, 140,000 businesses on their site were temporarily closed in March and 98,000 are permanently closed, with a huge number of the temporary closed set to never open their doors again. I know a common talking point is to say that this is just money. How could you possibly put money over health? But that dismissive statement ignores the humanity behind every story of unemployment or every business closure. There was a truly moving article in an Irish newspaper that simply told the stories of the small businesses that were forced closed. When you read these stories, you see that they are more than just money-making entities. They are often the result of decades of hard work and saving. They are these people's passion, their joy, their creativity, their memories, their love. They are the culmination of countless early mornings and late nights, often made by families to achieve a dream of doing what they always wanted. This last year, we've all walked down the street and seen a place we used to occasionally frequent boarded up and closed for good. We give a sigh of disappointment and carry on with our day. But to the person who made the place, they've lost everything. In that business, every single painting on the wall, every furniture choice, every quirky little decoration you noticed or quote on the wall that once made you smile is the result of that person's imagination and artistic vision. And now, through no fault of their own, it's just gone. Over the last few years, we've been hearing endlessly that we need to make it okay to talk about mental health. We need to remove the stigma around mental health. These same people have been very quiet about lockdown's impact on mental health. So why don't we look into it? Depression among adults in the UK has doubled. In Canada, depression more than doubled and anxiety quadrupled. In the United States, cases of depression have tripled. Ireland, who has the longest lockdown in Europe, had a government survey done in March this year, and it showed that less than half of people reported feeling enjoyment and only 1/3 of people reported feelings of happiness in a week. This, coupled with the crippling economic issues, lead to other problems that we are seeing throughout the Western world, such as increased alcoholism, drug use, obesity, a massive rise in domestic violence, and of course, suicides. There are examples of increased suicide rates coming from police forces and anecdotal examples in newspapers, but it is still too early to get reliable numbers. However, I fear this threat of suicide increases won't end with the pandemic. Times of economic recession caused suicides to rise, with the Wall Street crash and the 2008 financial collapse showing large increases, and we are sleepwalking into an economic disaster once this pandemic ends. For example, Ireland, one of the countries worst hit in 2008, had a 50% increase in male suicide. But by far the most saddening victims of this mental health crisis are young people. The CDC reported that the number of young adults with suicidal thoughts increased from 10% in 2018 to 25% in 2020, and 75% of young people reported to be struggling with a mental health problem during the pandemic. In Nevada, a surge in student suicide forced schools to reopen as their closures were directly linked as a cause. To put this in context with the wider pandemic, the American Institute for Economic Research estimates that the child COVID suicides, aka not the total number of suicides, just the increase directly linked to the pandemic, is greater than the total number of child COVID deaths. One major problem of the pandemic has been that health services have been incentivized to get COVID numbers down at all costs. And if this means neglecting other illnesses, even if they're more lethal, then so be it. We can see this by simply looking at missed medical procedures. The UK has reported 3 million patients have missed vital cancer screenings. According to an oncology report in The Lancet, in Canada, 54% of people had their cancer screenings cancelled, postponed or rescheduled. And 75% of recently diagnosed cancer patients said the same thing. In the United States, it was estimated that in just a 3-month period, there were 80,000 delayed cancer diagnoses, and a survey from the Prevent Cancer Foundation found that 35% of Americans had missed cancer screenings due to COVID. In Ireland, the government has said that cancer services will not fully resume until 2022 at the earliest. With cancer, it is not an exaggeration to say that just a small delay in diagnosis can make the difference between life and death, and this is happening to more and more people. Right now, countless people are being denied life-saving medical treatment out of fear of COVID or cancelled appointments. For context, the global COVID-related death toll, meaning those people who died of all causes but had a positive COVID swab, is less than 3 million. The average annual cancer death toll is 10 million. Unfortunately, it's not just cancer being delayed. The NHS says that over 4 million people are on waiting lists for treatments. 43% of Americans report missing healthcare appointments. In Ireland, 850,000 people are on waiting lists for hospital care. This is a nation of less than 5 million people. In a recent study in The Lancet that covered 17 countries, they discovered that stillbirths and maternal deaths increased by almost 1/3, and there was a 6-fold increase in ectopic pregnancies. Globally, healthcare has been denied, operations postponed, and crucial diagnoses missed. The results of these delays are beginning to show, and I fear in the next few years the reality of these cancellations will rear its ugly head and lead to tragedy for untold numbers of people. While everything that's been shown so far is of course awful, it is very first world focused, and the worst victims of lockdowns in the West might actually end up being the third world. Economically, lockdowns in the third world have been even more devastating than in the first world. Low fiscal capacity means that governments cannot make payments to people forced into unemployment. Drops in exports also greatly affect poverty levels. Also, the lockdowns in the West drastically reduce remittances back to the developing nations, adding further financial pressure on the poorest and most at-risk people. The structure of the economies of developing nations is very different to that of developed nations. One study finds that in the richest countries, 40% of jobs can be executed from home, but only 10% in the poorest countries. A recent World Bank report estimates that in 2020, extreme poverty, defined as subsisting on less than $1.90 a day, rose for the first time since the 1990s. They estimate that between 88 and 115 million more people than forecast will either remain or fall into this category because of the pandemic. The UN's Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs estimates that 6,000 children could die a day due to preventable causes directly linked to the COVID-19 response, and that the annual death toll from HIV, tuberculosis and malaria could double. These economic downturns also increase the likelihood of civil wars, which drives famine and mass displacement. Also, according to the OCHA, acute food insecurity may rise from 149 million pre-pandemic to 270 million because of the pandemic. These changes can lead to daily life becoming even more harrowing for the poorest people on earth, and especially to those disadvantaged in societies like women. A study on the impact of lockdown of self-employed women in Zambia showed some devastating results. These women were street vendors, selling mostly food and other similar products. Since lockdowns occurred, they had to close their businesses. They received no aid from the state, and 100% of participants reported inadequate food supplies, hopelessness at restarting their business as all their savings are being spent to keep their children alive, and inadequate access to health services and psychological trauma, while 50% had to default on medications, leading to ill health for them and their children. These lockdowns have disproportionately affected the poorest in our Western societies, and the effects have been even worse on the poorest of the poor in the developing world. These lockdowns are causing tens of millions to be pushed into starvation, abject poverty and early graves because of our mistakes. And what kind of future are we sleepwalking into? A world where human rights and civil liberties can be stripped away at any time in the name of safety, and you have to watch the TV every night with bated breath to see if you can be free today. A cold, sterile, soulless world where you're constantly surveilled, constantly tracked and traced and told to be happy about it. Where your freedoms come exclusively at the end of a needle. Your fellow humans are ticking biological bombs to be feared, and anyone brave enough not to conform is cast out. A world where children are taught to see others not as future friends to enjoy, meet or play with, but dangers to be avoided and distant from. A world where millions are waiting to go back to jobs and businesses that will never open their doors again. Millions more are battling with the effects of depression, loneliness, anxiety, alcoholism, drug abuse and suicide. A world where countless people have terminal cancers growing in them as I speak this very sentence that will be diagnosed too late. On top of this, the most at-risk people on earth are once again the ones to feel the worst brunt of our mistakes. Even if you agree with the lockdowns and believe they were effective, then you have to swallow all the costs of doing it. And that's something no governments are willing to even acknowledge, let alone own up to. I think these lockdowns might be one of the most disastrous policies implemented in my lifetime. And we've just scratched the surface of their impacts.